Hey folks, Mr. Hughes down here in Hughes Studios, and I wanted to elaborate a little bit on the last lesson that we did with the text tool and the ability to make it look a little bit cooler. So the first thing we're going to do is just make a new file. Again, the size of it doesn't matter because this is something we're just doing for practice. And I'm going to grab my text tool, some sort of font that you'd like, and I'm going to go ahead and just type some text on there. So there we go. Now, in order to change things, like I can add an outline to it, I can add some texture to it, I could add a gradient where it's like multiple colors on there. And in order to get access to that, I have to access what's called the layer styles. So to do that, I'm just going to double click on the layer here, not on the name. Remember, double clicking on the name itself will actually rename it. So I'm going to double click right here on the right hand side where there's nothing, and that brings up this layer style box right here, and you have all these different options on here that you can play around with. So one of the things that I might want to do is I want to add an outline to this. Well, that's actually in graphic design terms called a stroke. And if I click the stroke button right here, notice that there's a red outline that gets added to it. Well, I don't want red. A red outline on a red text doesn't really work. So I want to be able to change that. Well, when I check it, you'll notice here that I'm still in blending options mode, kind of this generic blending mode. And if I click on the word stroke, notice now I'm actually looking at the properties of stroke. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Maybe I choose a completely different color. I'll choose blue. Notice it has a blue outline now that I can kind of play around with. So I can make it thicker or thinner. I can change the position of it so it actually goes inside the text or outside. I find outside or center usually works the best, but you never know. Blending mode we'll talk about in a different tutorial. We're going to talk about opacity. You can make it a little bit more see-through if you wanted to, and the fill type, you can either make it a solid fill, you can make it a gradient where it fades from one color to another, or you can make it a pattern where you actually have styles in there that you can play around with. So these are all a whole bunch of options that you can play around with. Again, you could add an outer glow to this. If you wanted to turn the feature off, that doesn't look good for me, I don't want it, you can turn it off. Let's see what happens. We can add a drop shadow to this. And again, by clicking on the word, we can play around with, how far the shadow is away. You notice that there's a whole bunch of different options. So I'm not going to go through them all. You're welcome to play around with them. The one that I find that people don't quite understand is the bevel and emboss. And beveling and embossing is basically, do you want the text to make it look like it's coming out of the page or going into the page? So think about chiseling a piece of wood or having it actually extrude, pop out, coming out of it. So those are a couple things that you can kind of play around with. So play around with them and see what happens to your text, and you can make it look pretty awesome. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention was that we mentioned in the last lesson that this is a vector right now. And I know that because I can resize the text and it looks exactly the same. Now you might say, well, Mr. Hughes, when I zoom in on it, I notice that it's all dots. So how is this a vector? It doesn't make sense because I should see little paths instead of the actual dots. Well, what's happening is the program is actually rasterizing it at each stage. So it's a vector, and then when you resize it, it converts it to a bitmap or converts it to a bitmap. So it's kind of constantly converting as you go along. But one of the problems that we have is if I grab my eraser tool right now and I try and erase, it doesn't let me. It gives me this error message saying it has to be rasterized first, meaning this thing hasn't been actually converted to dots yet that you can erase. It's still paths and you're not allowed to erase those. So do you want to rasterize it? So a couple things that you can do is you can click OK at this point, and now if I use my eraser tool or any other little filters or whatever the case may be in this program, you can actually manipulate your text now. So you notice now I can actually erase it. And when I look at my layer here, it doesn't have the letter T on it anymore. So if I undo that, keep undoing until the letter T comes back. The other thing you can do, instead of grabbing the eraser and starting to erase and waiting for that pop-up message, you can actually right-click on the layer and choose rasterize. And now you have all those filter options, erasing options, and all that sort of stuff that you can do to actually manipulate this. So those are some basic or a little bit more advanced techniques that you can use with your text tool.